Back in the early 2000s, it was hard to find a series that was a bigger runaway success than Call of Duty. While extremely well established nowadays, 2007 to roughly 2012 was a meteoric time for the series. Going from a PC-only title in 2003 to being a multi-million copy-selling franchise in just a few years isn't an accomplishment to sneeze at. Between CoD 4, World at War, and Modern Warfare 2, the series had made great leaps in just 3 years, and that trend was set to continue in 2010. While Infinity Ward were the main team running things at the time, sister studio Treyarch wasn't a slouch when it came to developing their own entries in the series. While Call of Duty 3 and World at War may have borrowed heavily from the titles that came before them, their next game aimed to be far more original. While World at War is fondly looked at today, one could knock it at the time and even now for the elements and innovations it borrowed from CoD 4. It makes sense to a degree though. CoD 4 changed not just what the series was as a whole, but how multiplayer games worked in general. So keeping those innovations in your next title were a must. Also, Treyarch was developing World at War at the exact same time they were developing 2 other games for Activision, with release dates mere weeks apart. So it's unlikely they had a full staff working on it. Which to a degree just makes the game all the more impressive. If the biggest complaint you can have about World at War is that it just doesn't do too much new a year after CoD 4 revolutionized the FPS landscape, you've probably done a pretty good job. Once the teams at Treyarch got their 2008 games out the door though, the entire studio was now free to work on their next project as a unified group. Treyarch now had an important decision to make. While World at War had done well, the Modern Warfare games were the better sellers compared to Treyarch's last effort. So instead of getting caught too far in the past, but also not risking encroaching on Infinity Ward's territory, Treyarch opted to move the setting of their next game to the Cold War. This move proved to be extremely popular, as upon release in the fall of 2010, Black Ops became an instant bestseller and helped kick off the multi-year trend of Call of Duty games becoming the biggest entertainment launches of all time. I think this was possible in part thanks to Treyarch clearly wanting to make a name for themselves. Instead of simply copying what Infinity Ward had done the year prior, but with a Cold War skin, Treyarch made further innovations in multiplayer. Black Ops' gameplay and weapon balance was in many ways more refined than Modern Warfare 2's, allowing for more customization and a new way to unlock items with in-game currency rather than simply unlocking perks and weapons by leveling up. And that's not even mentioning classic kill streaks being introduced, such as the RCXD. Certain maps were also interactive, adding a new dynamic to combat. They also introduced features such as Theater Mode, which allows players to revisit their matches from multiple angles, which helped give rise to many an aspiring YouTube gamer back in the day. As with most players, multiplayer is the franchise's bread and butter, so it's no wonder that so many players became obsessed with Black Ops. This title also marked my first foray into the series, and I can remember how special the game seemed back in the day. To someone barely beginning to dip their toe into the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, there wasn't quite anything else like Black Ops on the market. And looking back, it's still an incredibly special game. But for all the innovations Treyarch made in multiplayer, I think the biggest and most important improvements came in the campaign. Not to speak ill of the past 3 campaigns in COD's post-2007 era, but there is a certain simplicity to their stories and presentation. While effective, the mission briefing screens aren't the most dynamic way to tell a story, but prior to this point, they were really the only option, as fully animated and rendered cutscenes probably would have been too time-consuming and expensive to make. But around this time, a new tool was on the rise to really help streamline that process. That would be motion capture. Used to great effect at this point by Naughty Dog with the first 2 Uncharted games, Call of Duty had used motion capture before to help animate player movements and NPCs in combat. With Black Ops though, Treyarch utilized the process to help enhance the story as well. And while that's beneficial to the overall experience, the biggest improvement is really the script. The story of Black Ops is a mind-bending, action-packed thrill ride with deeper characters than we had seen before and insane set pieces that the devs could probably had only dreamed of including a few years prior. While I love the Modern Warfare games for mostly sticking to a grounded and gritty reality, I can't help but also appreciate Black Ops for turning the action up to 11, going full Michael Bay. Treyarch took a risk with this script, and had the story not been up to par, it probably would have been looked at just as another over-the-top camp-filled summer blockbuster-inspired shooter. Between the characters, the action, and of course the question at the center of the story, Black Ops more than lives up to the hype even 14 years later. So let's take a look at what makes this campaign so franchise-defining. We begin the game in a bit of an unconventional way, by sitting in a chair. The player takes control of Alex Mason, a CIA operative. We find him tied to a chair, clearly undergoing interrogation from mysterious figures with scary voices.
Where's the broadcast station?
I don't know what you're talking about.
The numbers, Mason. What do they mean? Where are they broadcast?
I don't know anything about any numbers.
What about Dragovich? Do you remember him? Give us what we want, we'll guarantee your safety.
Mason doesn't know what his interrogators are talking about, so they decide to go back to the beginning. The beginning turns out to be 1961 in Cuba. Mason is embedded with fellow operatives Frank Woods and Joseph Bowman. Their mission? Kill Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. After escaping from Cuban police during a meeting, the three use the Bay of Pigs invasion as a cover to kill Castro. Breaking into his estate, Mason and Woods kill Castro and move to extract their job done. When Cuban forces begin to overwhelm them, though, Mason stays behind to clear the runway and allow the others to escape back to the US. No good deed goes unpunished, though, and Mason is captured. He's then handed over to the Soviet Union by the real Castro, as the man who had died had simply been a body double. And thus, our plot is set into motion. Right off the bat with this level, Treyarch is upping their game from both their last entry and Modern Warfare 2. If there is one thing that can be said about this game, is that it has style. Beginning the mission by fading in from a lit cigar, engaging in a shootout with Havana police, and even participating in the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion, we have a great intro for our story here. Like the previous game, Treyarch uses history well. While World at War tried its best to be historically authentic, Black Ops takes another approach. Given the clandestine nature of many of these operations, Black Ops asks several engaging what-if questions about the history of the Cold War. From there, Mason is thrown into a Russian gulag known as Vorkuta. He's there for about 2 years before making his escape. Helping him in this quest is a familiar face to CoD players, as Viktor Reznov, now formerly of the Red Army, inspires an uprising within the prison, leading a massive revolt. Mason and Reznov fight their way through the prison, managing to overcome every obstacle in their way thanks to in-depth planning and knowledge of the facility. Already, just by Mission 2, the action and adrenaline has not let up. The Vorkuta escape mission has the same energy and urgency a third act mission normally would, but we're only on our second level here. So with freedom in sight, Mason and Reznov escape the prison on bikes and make it to a train, where Mason leaps to safety. But freedom doesn't come without a price.
Your turn! Come on! Step 8, Reznov! Freedom! For you, Mason! Not for me! Reznov!
And that was the last you saw of Viktor Reznov.
Yes. At least for a while.
Despite the loss of Reznov, Mason returns to the US to resume his duties and return the favor to the Russians for imprisoning him. Our next mission is what I think is arguably the most important one in the game, as it's less a mission and more of an overglorified cutscene, but for Call of Duty, this marks a huge leap forward. Mason and his new CIA handler Jason Hudson meet Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara at the Pentagon for a briefing on who exactly it was that held Mason captive for so long. Nikita Dragovich is a Russian hardliner whose sole goal is to bring down the West and win the Cold War. Not too different from other Call of Duty villains we've seen so far, but there are a few things that make Dragovich a more interesting villain, but we'll get to that later. Once inside the Pentagon, Hudson and McNamara leave Mason with President John F. Kennedy, who gives him the order to make sure Dragovich's days are numbered. While similar to Call of Duty 4's mission The Coup, in where the player is mostly just along for the ride and doesn't really do much, USDD instead has multiple camera angles and cutaways to show the player character walking around, while intermittently returning and taking control away from the player. The result is very cinematic, and a great way to carry the story forward. While not a big deal for Call of Duty today, this is a huge step forward for the series at the time, and a prelude to what we come to expect nowadays with the pre-rendered cutscenes and cinematic storytelling in the more modern entries of the series. So with their orders, Mason and Woods head to Baikonur, Russia to stop Dragovich's latest scheme, which happens to be part of the Soviet rocket program. The team is there to meet up with Weaver, a Soviet defector. Weaver's mission was to infiltrate the facility and disable the rocket before it could launch. However, he was found out and captured by Dragovich's second-in-command, Kurchenko. Trying to goad the other operators out of hiding, Kurchenko cuts out Weaver's eye, forcing the unit to save him before continuing with the mission. Making their way through the rocket facility, they gun down soldiers and scientists alike, robbing the Soviets of valuable knowledge. It's implied that it's because of this covert mission that the Soviets never make it to the moon despite tons of advances early in the space race. But the final blow to this particular launch comes when Mason shoots down the rocket shortly after takeoff. What follows is probably the weirdest moment of the campaign, what I can only assume is a cut section. Dragovich tries to make a run for it and the team goes after him, but instead of letting this play out, we only get to experience it through flashes. Seems like an easy opportunity for a chase sequence, and the pacing of this mission just suddenly screeches to a halt and it's over, which is why I'm assuming a section was cut. But moving on, the team seems to think that Dragovich is no more following the chase and head back to the US. While Mason isn't 100% convinced, he's got a job to do. Years pass and Mason continues to work for the CIA, eventually ending up in Vietnam in early 1968. There's word about covert Soviet activity aiding the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, so Mason and the others are called in to see what they can uncover. Before they can even get started though, they find themselves smack dab in the middle of the Tet Offensive and have to fight off attackers at Khe Sanh. This mission gives us a lot of gameplay variety and great scripted moments. Overall, it's an insanely chaotic mission, which is fitting.
Nah, baby.
After fighting back the enemy temporarily, the team can finally get onto their actual mission. Their first task is to grab a Soviet defector, which sounds easy enough, but he's in the middle of Hue, which is overrun with North Vietnamese troops. This mission involves lots of close quarters urban combat, which is a nice change of pace compared to the jungles and prisons and rocket facilities we've been in prior. Locating the defector, Mason finds that it's actually Reznov, who managed to escape from Vorkuta after all. The SOG team managed to extract Reznov and learn what they can from him about Dragovich's plan. Dragovich is planning to unleash a chemical weapon known as Nova 6 on the West. In order to stop it, Hudson and Weaver track down Dr. Daniel Clark, one of the scientists who helped formulate it. They find him in Kowloon, the walled city in Hong Kong, but they aren't the only ones. Dragovich's men descend on them to make sure Clark doesn't reveal what he knows about the project, or the secret numbers broadcast that keeps popping up. A chase ensues amongst the rooftops as the Soviets try to reach Clark, and they eventually shoot him dead, right before he can tell Hudson what the numbers mean. What they did learn, though, was that the chemical weapon was primarily masterminded by a former Nazi scientist known as Steiner, and Reznov is all too familiar with his work.
My father was a musician in Stalingrad. During the German occupation, the sound of his violin filled the air with magnificent music. Korsakov, Stasov, many of the great nationalist composers. To my countrymen, it was a symbol of hope. To the Germans, it was a symbol of defiance. Even now, his music still haunts me. The Nazis slit his throat while he slept. Collaborating with any Nazi is a betrayal against all of Mother Russia. Dragovich, Krashenko were not troubled by such matters. They look only to advance their own interests and agendas.
We then flash back to the 1940s, after the end of the Second World War. We play as Reznov as he and the Red Army mop up what little Nazi stragglers remain. His division is led by Dragovich and Krashenko, and they're looking for a Nazi scientist who has promised to help the Soviets in exchange for his life. Along for the ride is the playable character from World at War, Dmitry Porchenko. Despite telling Dmitry to be wary of Dragovich, they follow him into the Nazi encampment and find the scientist, who turns out to be Steiner. Steiner then leads the Russians to a beached and frozen over cargo ship, which contains the only supply of Nova 6 the Germans were able to cultivate before Berlin fell. As it turns out, Reznov was right to be wary of Dragovich, as he orders Reznov and several of his men to be unwitting test subjects for the gas to make sure it works. Reznov is unable to do anything but watch as Dmitry dies to the poison.
Dmitry Porchenko was a hero. He deserved the hero's death. Instead of giving his life for the glory of the motherland, he died for nothing. Like an animal.
Thankfully, before it's Reznov's turn, British commandos storm the ship, looking for the Nova 6 themselves. Reznov and his squad are able to escape and watch as the fighting destroys the ship and the last remnants of the gas. He is eventually caught and charged with desertion, though, and thrown into Vorkuta.
The flag may be different, but the methods are the same. They will use you as they used me. You must decide. Decide what you think is worth fighting for. Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner. These men must die.
It's here I want to point out what a stellar cast this game has. Gary Oldman returns from World at War to once again play Reznov, and Clark as well, funnily enough. Joining him for this go-around are also Sam Worthington of James Cameron's Avatar fame as Mason, James C. Burns as Woods, Ed Harris as Hudson, and Ice Cube as Bowman. While other COD games would get relative unknowns and popular voice actors for their campaigns prior to this, Black Ops has a fairly stacked cast and utilizes them well. I think getting Sam Worthington at the time was actually a huge get, as between 2007 and 2011-ish, he was in high demand at the time. Clearly someone in Hollywood saw something in him, as he was cast in a bunch of big projects that ironically all sort of kinda didn't do too well, with the exception of Avatar. It's also funny that he often gets cast as American despite being Australian, which you can sometimes hear slip out every now and then.
Castro's paranoid. Good reason. Been trying to get him for 3 years.
Today's the day we succeed.
What also helps the story shine is that for the first time in a COD game, you play as a fully voiced protagonist. This helps us become much more attached to our characters, as no longer is the commanding officer just giving orders to a silent subordinate. Mason talks with all of his allies, helping demonstrate the bond he shares with them. The framing device for the story is also used well, as given these are all technically flashback missions, the interrogator will sometimes pipe in and ask questions during gameplay, helping to further flesh out the characters. I also want to point out how good this game looks compared to World at War. I think we're going to look back and underestimate some of the graphical leaps there were during this console generation. In just 2 years, we went from faces and textures like this in 2008 to faces and textures like this in 2010. There's a big jump there, and it's crazy to look at, especially nowadays where I feel like graphical advancement in games have really started to slow down. Getting back to the story though, the interrogators ask about Mason's next moves in Vietnam when tracking down Dragovich. He tells them about one mission that put them back on his trail. It begins with a helicopter crash in a river. Reznov, now helping them with their search for Dragovich, saves Mason and Woods from drowning, and the three link up with Bowman to take out a Viet Cong camp. Here is also what I believe is the first time in CoD history you get the ability to swim, which is a cool feature to see implemented. After attacking the Viet Cong camp, Woods tells Mason to clear out a rat nest with another member of the SOG. It's in here I had a funny moment as my PC didn't seem to like the lighting setup in this section, so everyone turns into shadow people. Reznov especially looked really funny with his floating goatee and buzz-cut hair. But moving on, after Reznov splits off to clear another tunnel, the other SOG member is killed and Mason is forced to confront the other shadow people alone. He and Reznov eventually link back up and find a Soviet bunker with a recording of Kurchenko on it, proving that they're involved. The room is rigged with charges though, and the two barely make it out. From there, Hudson redirects the team to Laos to retrieve the cargo of a downed plane the CIA thought was carrying Nova 6. Now another thing this game does well is dipping into the Vietnam War era aesthetic and imagery. Clearly inspired by movies such as Apocalypse Now and music from the era, the game has no issue pulling and licensing popular music to play during the game to help you feel even more immersed in the time. For instance, the SOG team needs to head upriver to find the crashed plane. Instead of playing more action music, which would have worked fine, Woods turns on the radio and the Rolling Stones play Sympathy for the Devil. It's these little touches that help make this game more than just another FPS. So the team eventually make their way to the plane, but end up getting ambushed by Spetsnaz and captured by Dragovich and Kurchenko. A week later, Hudson and Weaver are following up their own leads on Project Nova at Mount Yamantau, which some have speculated in the past to be Russia's Area 51. Helping them reach the site is an SR-71 Blackbird, and one of the only missed opportunities in this game in my opinion. In this mission, you help lead Hudson and his forces through the mountain pass while occasionally switching back down to first person to infiltrate buildings. While cool in concept, I don't think this really worked out too well in execution. It's just a little clunky to control, they don't explain how the controls work all that well. So at least in my experience, you kinda have to fumble your way through it. Also odd is that this is the only mission in the game that does this. I feel like this might have been something they had initially planned to be a recurring segment in the game, but they couldn't get it to work very well, so they just kept it for the one mission. I don't know, points for trying I guess. Anyway, the team navigates their way through the facility and end up getting contacted by Steiner directly. As it turns out, working for a psychopathic Russian has its drawbacks, so Steiner wants out, and is willing to tell the Americans what he knows about Nova 6 and the Numbers program in exchange for his life. He tells them to meet him on Rebirth Island, and Hudson Weaver manage to escape just in the nick of time before an avalanche buries the facility. Meanwhile, back at Laos, Wood and Mason are forced to participate in the game of Russian roulette after the Russians have decided they are no longer of use. But giving these two a loaded gun ends up being a bad idea, as the two break free and make it to a helicopter which they use to tear a path through the jungle to Kurchenko's hideout. After releasing a group of prisoners, including Reznov, they corner Kurchenko, who then pulls the pins on a grenade belt, so Woods is forced to throw them clear and away from Mason, killing them both. But Woods' sacrifice wasn't for nothing, as Mason and Reznov find the location of where Steiner is so they can help put an end to Nova 6 once and for all. Together, Reznov and Mason infiltrate Rebirth Island just as Hudson and Weaver arrive with an invasion force. They fight their way through the Russian guards and manage to catch Steiner before he can escape. At long last, after 20 years, Reznov can finally avenge the death of his comrades.
My name is Victor Reznov, and I will have my revenge!
Meanwhile, on the other side of the glass, Hudson and Weaver fight their way across the island and survive a Nova 6 strike, just to make it to Steiner as Reznov fires the fatal shot.
My name is Victor Reznov, and I will have my
Revenge! Mason, no! I'm fine. Check Steiner. He's dead. What about Reznov, the defector? We need to find him.
We won't. He was never here.
We're now caught up to the present. Mason still isn't sure why he's being interrogated when his interrogators know everything he already does. They've known about the gas, the missions, the deaths, everything, but yet they keep asking him about the numbers. Hudson, who's been the interrogator this entire time, finally lays it all out on the table. A Nova 6 strike on the US is imminent and they're out of time. Hudson tells Mason that there was no Victor Reznov. He died trying to escape Vorkuta after helping Mason escape. The Reznov that Mason saw was merely a figment of his imagination, a figment of the programming that Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner tried imbuing inside Mason to do whatever they wanted. When they thought he'd resisted the programming, they threw him in Vorkuta, where Reznov managed to rework it for his own purposes.
The pain is difficult, isn't it? We are brothers, Mason. We are the same. Dragovich, Kravchenko, Steiner, all must die.
Mason can't handle the truth and breaks out, only to be bombarded with memories from the past 8 years as his mind reels with the truth. Every time Reznov was on screen after Vorkuta was a figment, and the real Soviet defector in Vietnam died during the Tet Offensive, only leaving behind a dossier on Dragovich. The game both hides and telegraphs us very well for those paying attention. When Reznov is around, none of the other characters ever acknowledge him, just Mason. Also, there are lots of moments when the numbers can be heard in the background whenever he's on screen, tipping the player off to the fact that something's not right about him. This is such a cool twist, and I remember being blown away with my jaw on the floor when I played this for the first time back in early 2011. It makes the player reconsider the whole game over and think about when and where Reznov wasn't. It's something I think about every now and then, just think, dang, that was cool. It's also a gutsy twist, especially for such a fan-favorite character such as Reznov. It was a great way to continue his story from World at War, as his arc in that game was slowly realizing how horrible all the brutal things he was doing was. Having him learn from those experiences and being able to realize that the gas is too much for any one superpower to control was a great character choice. World at War is an admittedly simpler game narrative-wise, so to see it expanded on here so well is awesome. But continuing with this story, finally, with the brainwashing wearing off, Mason understands what the numbers mean. The numbers were the activation code for Dragovich's sleeper agents, and he knows where they're broadcast from. The story now comes full circle, and Mason realizes that the signal is coming from a ship near Cuba, the Rusalka, and only by stopping the broadcast can they stop the Nova 6 strike. The CIA loads up and heads for the Gulf of Mexico, finding the Rusalka and attacking it. Moving inside, they realize that Dragovich would have been a good Bond villain, as his real base is underwater. The team heads down and destroys the base, stopping the broadcast and the Nova 6 attack. With only one loose end left, Mason manages to catch Dragovich and drowns him, ending his threat once and for all. Hudson and Mason swim for the surface and are pulled to safety by Weaver, happy the danger is finally over.
Mason! It is over. We won.
For now.
But while the world is saved, not everything is quite right, as there's still a nagging thought in the back of Mason's mind.
17, 0, 10, 2, 23, 1, 8, 11, 25, 22,
22.
9, 4,
6.5 millimeter.
9, 23, 1, 12, 0, 12, 16,
11, 22.
6, 12, 8, 4, 1, 6, 2, 10, 2, 1.
Texas. Ascension.
This is what I think helps make Dragovich stand out among some of the other Call of Duty villains. While he doesn't quite reach the levels of original trilogy General Shepard and Makarov for me, his cold-blooded ruthlessness and the brainwashing make him a real force to be reckoned with. Leaving a little lingering doubt that he may have indeed succeeded in brainwashing Mason enough to have been involved with JFK's assassination is a great little teaser to leave off on. And with that, we have the end to Black Ops. There's really not enough praise I can give this game. It's an all-time classic for a reason. Like COD 4 before it, it does so much right that the things it introduced here are often considered to be staples of the franchise at this point. Cinematic storytelling, fully voiced protagonists, a good use of history, etc. It's no wonder this game did so well, and that at the time, Treyarch was given their due amount of credit for it. At a time when Infinity Ward was beginning to struggle, fans could at least be assured that the franchise was in safe hands. While Black Ops was a huge success in 2010, Treyarch now had 2 years to think about what they could do next. Thankfully, that's plenty of time to look ahead to the future.